In the quiet moments, when the house is still and the lake outside lies like glass, that's when I remember him most vividly. The smell of cedar and the faintest trace of mint he left on the air, his gaze catching mine from across the room, or the way his voice held a hesitance, a kind of reverence, when he spoke to me. Harlan Moss was a spark I never expected, a reckless slip of indulgence in a life I had otherwise spent carefully and cautiously. And now, as I sit here, tracing the lines of that memory, I can't help but wonder if, for all its darkness, there wasn't some beauty in it too. I was simply living as I always had, tidily, predictably. Alistair, my stepson, had come to stay for the weekend with his friend Harlan, a young man whose name I barely registered at the time. They arrived at the house, arms laden with a week's worth of groceries and gear, filling the quiet space with the sounds of laughter and clinking bottles. Alistair, now nearly 40, had grown into a reserved, introspective man, carrying himself with the same stoic resolve as his father. We had our little routine, my stepson and I, an easy, familiar relationship, grounded in the unspoken respect we'd developed over the years. So when he brought Harlan along, I assumed it would be nothing more than another weekend, until the moment that changed everything. I remember it with a vividness that surprises me still. I was alone in the house, or so I thought, enjoying a rare bath. I let my guard down, a rare indulgence, and allowed myself to drift in the warmth and scent of lavender. Lost in my thoughts, I didn't hear the soft footsteps. The door creaked open, and there he stood. Harlan. His face turned a deep shade of crimson as he stammered an apology, and in those few seconds his eyes locked with mine before he retreated. My heart pounded fiercely, and in that raw moment of vulnerability, something shifted. That was the first spark, a tiny ember lodged in my mind that refused to extinguish. At first, I tried to dismiss it, tried to reason with myself that it was nothing more than an innocent mistake. But as the days passed, I felt a strange curiosity growing, a restlessness I hadn't felt in decades. I found myself watching for him, noting the way he moved with that youthful energy, the confidence that came so naturally to him. What struck me most, perhaps, was that he didn't treat me with the polite distance most young men might offer a woman of my age. His eyes met mine with something like reverence, a quiet admiration that flattered and unnerved me all at once. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, my mind replaying that brief but intense moment again and again, lingering on details I had no business remembering. The gentle rise of his chest as he'd caught his breath in shock, the exact shade of his eyes, a dark forest green that glinted with something I couldn't quite place. The next morning, I hoped that I could brush it all off, act as though nothing had happened. When I walked downstairs to the kitchen, Alistair was already seated at the breakfast table, hunched over the plans for their new project, while Harlan poured himself a cup of coffee at the counter. For a moment, he caught my eye, and an unmistakable flicker of recognition passed between us, a silent acknowledgement of our shared secret. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, and immediately turned to busy myself with preparing breakfast. It was ridiculous, I told myself. I was 72 years old, a woman who had lived through enough hardship and disappointment to know that fantasies were exactly that. Fantasies. But there was something about Harlan that stirred an old part of me, one I thought I had buried long ago. In the days that followed, I found myself watching him more closely, studying his every movement with a scrutiny that surprised me. He would laugh with Alistair, throwing his head back with a carefree abandon that felt as foreign to me as it was mesmerizing. When he spoke, he had a way of leaning in, giving whoever he was speaking to his undivided attention, as though they were the only person in the room. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, Alistair had stepped out to take a phone call, leaving Harlan and me alone in the dimly lit den. He was quiet, his usual exuberance replaced by a kind of thoughtful silence. After a while, he turned to me and, with a shy, almost boyish smile, said, "I hope you don't think I'm too forward for saying this, but I really admire the way you carry yourself, Mrs. Ashford. It's rare to meet someone with such poise." The comment took me off guard, and for a moment I felt an odd sense of thrill. There was a warmth in his eyes, an openness that was both flattering and dangerous. I allowed myself to smile just slightly and replied, "That's very kind of you to say, Harlan, but please call me Isolde." His smile widened, and I felt my heart flutter, a reaction that at my age was as unexpected as it was exhilarating. We continued our conversation, slipping into a rhythm that felt comfortable and yet charged with an unspoken tension. Harlan asked me about my work in art history, and I found myself animatedly recounting stories from my years traveling across Europe, studying Renaissance masterpieces and ancient relics. Over the next week, Harlan continued to visit the house frequently, always under the guise of work with Alistair. But gradually it became clear to both of us that his reasons for being there extended beyond professional obligations. Our interactions took on an almost ritualistic quality, an exchange of glances, a lingering touch, a moment of shared laughter. One afternoon, while Alistair was working in his studio, Harlan and I found ourselves alone in the garden. I was tending to the roses, carefully pruning the blossoms when he approached, quietly enough that I didn't hear him until he was standing beside me. "They're beautiful," he said softly, gesturing to the roses, "but they don't hold a candle to you." It was a simple statement, almost innocent in its phrasing, but it carried a weight that neither of us could ignore. I felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with a pang of guilt. I was old enough to know better, but something about Harlan's presence seemed to erode the boundaries I had so carefully built around my life. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, I allowed myself to truly see him. Not just as Alistair's friend, not just as a young man full of potential, but as someone who, for reasons I couldn't quite understand, saw something in me that I thought had long since faded. The moment stretched between us, filled with a silence that was both tender and electric. Finally I spoke, my voice barely a whisper. "Harlan, you don't know what you're saying." He reached out, his fingers brushing my hand, and there was a gentleness to his touch that took my breath away. "I know exactly what I'm saying, Isolde," he replied, his voice steady and resolute. "And I think you feel it too." In that instant, I felt a rush of emotions, exhilaration, fear, longing, all colliding within me. I was old enough to know that life offered few second chances, and fewer still that came without a price. But for the first time in years, I felt truly alive, as though I were standing on the edge of a precipice, poised to leap into the unknown. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself wandering through the house, my mind restless and filled with thoughts of Harlan. I ended up in the den, staring out the window at the dark expanse of the lake, the moon casting a silver glow over the water. I heard footsteps behind me, and when I turned, there he was. Harlan, his expression mirroring the same turmoil I felt within myself. Neither of us spoke, but the silence was enough. In that quiet space, away from prying eyes and judgment, we allowed ourselves to cross the line we had danced around for so long. He stepped closer, and I felt his hand gently touch my face, his thumb tracing the lines that time had etched into my skin. There was a reverence in his gaze, a kind of awe that made me feel beautiful in a way I hadn't in years. When he leaned in, his kiss was soft, hesitant at first, as though he were afraid to break the spell. But as our lips met, all of my doubts and fears faded away, replaced by a sense of freedom and exhilaration that I had thought was beyond my reach. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Alistair, not the years between us, not even the life I had so carefully built. All that existed was the two of us, suspended in time, lost in a world of our own making. In the days that followed our first kiss, I found myself torn between exhilaration and guilt. Each time I looked into Alistair's eyes, I felt an ache of betrayal, a reminder of the boundaries I had crossed with his friend Harlan. Yet every glance, every secret meeting with Harlan seemed to pull me deeper into this impossible affair. The affair itself was not explosive, but rather quietly consuming, like a fire that builds slowly, smoldering beneath the surface. Harlan would come by the house often under the pretense of work, and each visit felt like a precious gift wrapped in secrecy. There was an art to our deceit, a glance that lingered a moment too long, a passing touch that sent a surge of warmth through me. I became adept at keeping my feelings contained, a smile held tight when I wanted to laugh, a passing comment that belied the depths of what I truly felt. Harlan, too, seemed changed. The youthful ease that had once defined him took on a new intensity, a quiet ardor that seemed to fuel his every move. He would look at me with that deep, knowing gaze, and I'd feel as though he could see through every mask I had ever worn, right to the part of me that had longed quietly for something more. One weekend, Alistair had to attend an architectural conference in the city, leaving me and Harlan alone at the house. The anticipation that hung between us was thick, each moment a beat in a song we both seemed to know by heart. That evening, we shared a quiet dinner, the only sound the gentle clink of silverware and the whisper of our own breaths. As we finished eating, Harlan reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that we were more than just two people caught in a fleeting affair, that perhaps there was a world where I could be free to love him openly, without the weight of secrecy and guilt. "Isolde," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I can't keep this a secret forever. I want to be with you. Really be with you." His words struck me with a sharp clarity, tearing down the illusions I had built to protect myself. I wanted to believe in that dream he was offering, a life where age and circumstance didn't matter, where we could share ourselves freely. But reality was an ever-present shadow, reminding me of the life I had built, the family I had made. This was not a world where a woman my age left her family for a young man with nothing but promises. I took a breath, steadying myself. "Harlan, I care for you deeply, but you know we cannot have a life together. Not like this." His face fell, the hurt clear in his eyes, but he held my gaze with a determination that sent a shiver through me. "I don't care about the rules or what people think. I know what I feel, and I know it's real. Can you say it's not?" The question hung in the air, a challenge I wasn't prepared to answer. I could deny the depth of what I felt, but not its truth. The life he was offering, though painfully unrealistic, called to a part of me that was starved for freedom, for passion. The affair, once carefully concealed, began to bleed into my daily life. I found myself slipping out at odd hours, meeting Harlan in quiet corners of the town, places where we could simply exist together, without the specter of judgment hanging over us. Each encounter grew bolder, more dangerous, and each moment was like a stolen piece of happiness, a joy tempered by the ever-present fear of discovery. One afternoon, we met in a secluded park on the edge of town. The trees cast long shadows, providing a natural cover for our whispered words and lingering touches. As I looked at him, framed by the dappled sunlight, I realized just how far I had drifted from the woman I once was. This affair had become an anchor and a burden, a source of both joy and unbearable risk. But in that park, with Harlan's hands gently framing my face, the fear dissolved, replaced by something deeper, a kind of resolve. This wasn't simply a fleeting passion. It was a connection that had somehow slipped into my life, changing it forever. I could not deny the truth of it any longer. "Harlan," I whispered, pressing my hand over his. "I don't know where this will lead, but whatever happens, I need you to know that you've made me feel alive in a way I never thought possible." He leaned in, his voice a low murmur against my ear. "Then let's stop hiding, Isolde. I don't want to be just a secret." The words held a promise, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe that perhaps there was a way to be free. But as we pulled apart, both lost in our own thoughts, I saw a familiar face out of the corner of my eye. Alistair. He stood a few feet away, watching us with a look of disbelief and betrayal etched into his features. My heart plummeted, the weight of reality crashing down on me like a wave. That evening, Alistair confronted me, his voice thick with anger and hurt. He had always been my constant, the son I had raised as my own, and seeing the pain in his eyes was like a knife twisting in my heart. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with a raw fury I had never seen in him. I couldn't find the words to answer, each syllable caught in my throat, suffocated by shame and regret. But I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling. "Alistair, I never meant to hurt you. This wasn't planned. It just happened." He laughed, a bitter sound that cut through the silence. "Happened? You've betrayed me. Betrayed everything this family stands for. How could you do this with him of all people?" The guilt washed over me, a relentless tide. I wanted to explain, to make him understand the loneliness that had driven me to Harlan, The way his attention had filled a void I hadn't even realized existed. But words felt hollow, insufficient to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. Alistair left that night, his final words a sharp reminder of the cost of my actions. I trusted you, Isolde. I looked up to you. But now, I don't even know who you are. In the days that followed, I found myself alone in the house, the once familiar walls now a constant reminder of everything I had lost. Alistair cut off contact, and Harlan, too, drifted away, his own life marred by the scandal and shame of our affair. The silence became my only companion, each echo a reminder of the choices I had made. I spent my days wandering through empty rooms, retracing memories, wondering if there had been a moment, a single instant, where I could have chosen differently. I realized slowly that this affair had not simply been a selfish indulgence, but a revelation. A painful reminder of the parts of myself I had left buried beneath years of duty and restraint. In Harlan's arms I had found a freedom I hadn't known I needed, a taste of life unbound by the expectations of age or propriety. And yet, that freedom had come at a cost. The weeks following Alistair's departure were marked by a crushing silence. The once lively house felt desolate, the rooms thick with a kind of haunting quiet. Every corner seemed to hold a memory, a remnant of what I had so thoughtlessly shattered. In the mornings I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, replaying Alistair's final words in my mind like an unrelenting tide. I don't even know who you are, but I knew exactly who I was, a woman who had allowed herself to drift into forbidden waters, led by a need for validation and a thirst for something to break the monotony of years spent playing it safe. Each day felt heavier than the last, a weight pressing down on me as I came to terms with the reality of my choices. I wanted to reach out to Alistair, to find a way to explain, to ask for some kind of forgiveness. Yet every time I picked up the phone, words failed me. What could I say that would ease the pain I had inflicted? Harlan, too, had withdrawn. Though he'd initially tried to keep in touch, his messages had grown fewer, his visits non-existent. I knew he felt the shame of our affair just as keenly, his youthful vigor dimmed by the knowledge of the hurt we had caused. I hadn't meant to cut him off completely, but the sting of Alistair's betrayal had created a chasm too wide to bridge. And in truth, I wasn't sure if Harlan's presence would bring comfort or only deepen the guilt gnawing away at my conscience. In an attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, I returned to my routines, immersing myself in the things that had once brought me comfort. I resumed volunteering at the local art museum, spending quiet afternoons cataloging exhibits, my hands moving mechanically as my mind wandered back to that moment in the park when Alistair had seen us together. My heart ached with the memory, a pain made sharper by the absence of Harlan's warmth, his laugh, the way he had made me feel young again. One afternoon, I decided to clean out the attic, hoping that the distraction would ease the sense of suffocation that had settled over me. As I sorted through old boxes and forgotten relics, I found an old photograph of Alistair and me from years ago, standing on the front steps of the house. He was smiling, his arm around my shoulders, his face filled with a youthful admiration that struck me with fresh pain. I sat there, staring at the photo for what felt like hours, tracing the edges of his face with trembling fingers. It was strange, looking back on that time and realizing how much had changed, how much I had changed. I felt as though I were staring at a different woman, someone who had been certain of her place in the world, who had lived by a clear set of rules. That woman had disappeared the moment I allowed myself to fall for Harlan, replaced by someone I could barely recognize. One evening as I was preparing for bed, the phone rang. My heart leapt as I saw Harlan's name flash across the screen. Hesitating for only a moment, I answered. Isolde. His voice was soft, hesitant, and the sound of it stirred emotions I thought I had buried. Harlan, I replied, my own voice catching. I wasn't sure I'd hear from you again. I wasn't sure I'd call, he admitted, a note of sadness evident in his tone. I don't want things to end this way. I can't stand the thought of you feeling alone. I know what we did was wrong, but I also know it wasn't meaningless. There was a truth in his words that I couldn't deny. Our affair, reckless as it was, had awakened something in me, A reminder of the woman I once was, of the desires and dreams I had long buried. I wanted to tell him that, to share with him the depth of what I had felt, but words failed me. "I don't regret you, Harlan," I finally whispered, "but I regret the pain we caused." Silence hung between us, heavy and thick. Finally he sighed. "I understand. I wanted you to know that, for whatever it's worth, you meant a lot to me." With that, the call ended, leaving me in the darkened room, alone with the quiet hum of the phone and a lingering sense of loss. As the week stretched on, I found myself questioning everything that had led me to this moment. The love I had found with Harlan had been beautiful in its way, a rare connection that defied age and circumstance. Yet it had also been tainted, stained by the hurt we had inflicted on Alistair, by the betrayal of trust that could never be fully mended. I began to wonder if perhaps this affair had been my way of escaping the monotony of my life. A desperate attempt to reclaim a part of myself I felt had slipped away with age. Harlan had given me a glimpse into a world where I was still desirable, still capable of inspiring passion. But that glimpse had come at a cost, one that now felt insurmountable. One evening, as I sat by the lake, watching the ripples dance across the surface, I realized that forgiveness, both from Alistair and from myself, would be a long and difficult road. But it was one I had to walk, no matter how painful. I had spent my life carefully constructing a version of myself that was respectable, upstanding, bound by duty and honor. And in a single act, I had unraveled all of it. I knew that I needed to reach out to Alistair, to offer him some form of explanation, if not an apology. The hurt I had caused could not be undone, but perhaps there was a way to mend the shattered pieces of our relationship. I sat down at my desk, pen in hand, and began to write. "Dear Alistair, there are no words that can undo the pain I've caused, nor can I justify the choices that led me to betray you. But I want you to know that my actions were not born out of malice or disregard for our family. I was lost, searching for something I couldn't name, and Harlan was simply there, offering a kindness I hadn't realized I needed. This letter is not a request for forgiveness, though I would be grateful for it. It is simply my way of telling you that I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the hurt I have caused. You are my son in every way that matters, and nothing, no mistake or misstep, will ever change that. With all my love, Isolde." I sealed the letter, sending it off with a mixture of hope and dread. I knew that there was no guarantee he would respond, no promise that he would find it in his heart to forgive me. But it was a start, a step toward healing. In the end, the affair with Harlan became a part of my story, a painful, complicated chapter in a life that was far from perfect. It had shown me parts of myself that I had forgotten, reigniting a spark that I thought had died long ago. And though I would carry the weight of that affair with me for the rest of my days, I also knew that I could not regret the love that had bloomed, however briefly. In time, Alistair and I would speak again, his forgiveness slow and tentative, but there nonetheless. Our relationship, once fractured, found a new strength, one tempered by honesty and acceptance of our shared humanity. I had hurt him, yes, but in that hurt, we had also found a way to connect more deeply, to see each other as flawed, complex individuals. As for Harlan, he remained a quiet presence in my memory, a reminder of a love that had been real, if fleeting. I would think of him sometimes with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, knowing that our paths had crossed for a reason, and that he had left an indelible mark on my life. In the end, life returned to its quiet rhythms, the scandal fading into memory, leaving only the lessons I had learned and the person I had become. And as I sat by the lake, watching the sunset, I felt a quiet peace settle over me, a sense of acceptance for the journey I had walked, with all its twists and turns. The coffee slipped from my hand before I even registered what was happening. 1 second I was holding the mug, and the next, the steaming liquid was splashing across Ethan's chest, soaking his crisp white t-shirt. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I stammered, grabbing a dish towel and rushing toward him. "It's fine, Diana," he said, his voice calm but slightly strained as he pulled the shirt away from his skin. "It's just coffee." But it wasn't just coffee. Not when his shirt clung to him like that, outlining every inch of his chest and shoulders. Not when he reached behind his neck to tug the shirt off, revealing smooth, tan skin, stretched over lean muscle. I froze mid-step, the dish towel limp in my hand, as he stood there, shirtless and unbothered, looking down at the mess on the floor. Do you have something dry I can borrow?" he asked, his tone casual, as if I hadn't just turned into a statue. I snapped out of it, heat flooding my cheeks. Yes, of course. I'll grab you something." I turned quickly and fled to the laundry room, grateful for the chance to catch my breath. My heart was racing in a way it hadn't in years, and I hated myself for the way my mind was spinning. He was my stepson, for God's sake. Ethan had moved back home temporarily to save money after college, and I'd been trying to keep things friendly but distant. This wasn't supposed to happen, but as I pulled one of Mark's old shirts from the laundry basket, I realized it already had. That moment, his shirtless form, the easy confidence in the way he stood there, and the way I couldn't stop staring, had ignited something I didn't know was still inside me. Something dangerous. When I returned to the kitchen, Ethan was leaning against the counter, dabbing at his skin with a paper towel. He looked up and smiled faintly as I handed him the dry shirt. "Thanks," he said, his eyes lingering on mine a little too long. I nodded quickly, turning back toward the sink, hoping the water would cool my burning face. But even with my back to him, I could feel the weight of his gaze. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. That moment in the kitchen stayed with me longer than it should have. Long after Ethan had left the room, his voice and the faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air. I told myself it was nothing. Just a fleeting reaction to an awkward situation. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had been years since I'd felt that kind of heat coursing through me, that raw awareness of someone else's presence. Mark, my husband, was the reason for that. Our marriage had slowly eroded into a polite partnership. He was always working, always traveling, always just absent. At first I thought it was temporary, a phase we'd work through. But years passed, and we drifted further apart. The spark between us had been extinguished so long ago, I couldn't even remember what it felt like to be touched in a way that mattered. Ethan moving in had been Mark's idea. "He just needs a few months to save some money and figure things out," Mark had said over dinner one night. I'd agreed because it seemed harmless. Ethan was polite and quiet, and I didn't see the harm in letting him stay. But things started to change almost immediately. Ethan wasn't the awkward teenager I remembered from Mark's family photos. He was a man now, confident, charming, with an easy smile that could light up a room. He had a way of making everything seem effortless, even when he was just lounging on the couch or pouring a cup of coffee. And then there were the little things. The way he would brush past me in the kitchen, his hand grazing mine, or the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. It was subtle at first. I caught myself watching him from the corner of my eye, noticing the way his shirts clung to his chest, or how his voice dipped when he spoke. I told myself it was harmless, just a reaction to the loneliness I'd been carrying for years. But the feelings kept growing, and the more I tried to ignore them, the more they consumed me. The morning after the coffee incident, I woke up early, hoping to avoid seeing Ethan before he left for work. But as I stepped into the kitchen, there he was, shirtless again, sipping coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world. My heart stuttered in my chest, and I froze in the doorway, unsure whether to go back upstairs or pretend I hadn't noticed. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and relaxed. He didn't seem at all fazed by my awkwardness, which somehow made it worse. "Morning," I managed, forcing my legs to move. I busied myself with the coffee machine, keeping my back to him, but I could feel his eyes on me, and it was impossible to ignore the tension that had settled between us. "You don't have to keep avoiding me, you know?" he said after a moment, his tone light but teasing. "It's not like I've never taken my shirt off before." I turned sharply, my face hot. "I'm not avoiding you," I said quickly, though the lie felt paper-thin. I was caught off guard yesterday, that's all." He smiled, a small knowing curve of his lips that sent a jolt through me. "Fair enough." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts, until Ethan finally stood and set his mug in the sink. "Well, I should get going," he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of a chair. "Don't work too hard today." I nodded, barely managing a weak smile as he walked past me. But as soon as the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Ethan wasn't doing anything inappropriate. If anything, he was being perfectly normal. I was the one reading too much into it, letting my loneliness and frustration cloud my judgment. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feelings that had taken root. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone while Ethan worked out in the garage. I could hear the faint sound of music and the rhythmic clinking of weights, and curiosity got the better of me. I stood and walked to the window, peeking out just enough to see him through the partially open garage door. He was shirtless again, his back to me as he lifted a barbell. His muscles rippled with each movement, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just his body. It was the way he moved, so confident and sure of himself. I watched for longer than I should have, torn between guilt and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. When he turned suddenly, catching me in the act, I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. I hurried back to the couch, pretending to be engrossed in my phone when he walked into the room a few minutes later. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual but with a hint of amusement. "Fine," I said quickly, refusing to look at him. "Why?" "No reason," he said, but I could hear the smile in his voice as he walked past me and up the stairs. The turning point came a week later. Mark was away on another business trip, and Ethan and I were alone in the house. It was late, and I was in the kitchen, sipping a glass of wine and enjoying the quiet. Ethan came in, his hair damp from a shower, and leaned against the counter, watching me. "You're up late," he said, his voice low and warm. "So are you," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. But the way he looked at me made it impossible to pretend everything was normal. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "Can I ask you something?" he said after a moment. "Of course," I said, though my voice wavered. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" he asked, his tone almost hesitant. "Like you're just going through the motions, waiting for something to change?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I just stared at him, the weight of his gaze making it impossible to look away. "I feel like that all the time," he continued, his voice soft. "But lately, I don't know, it feels different." The air between us felt electric, charged with something neither of us dared to name. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched his hand. The moment my fingers brushed his skin, it was like a dam broke. Ethan stepped closer, his hand covering mine, and the look in his eyes was something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just desire, it was understanding, connection, something I hadn't felt in years. When he leaned in, his lips brushing mine, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The kiss was tentative at first, filled with doubt and hesitation, but then it deepened, and everything else melted away. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Only him, only us, and the fire that had been smoldering between us for weeks. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and shaken, Ethan looked at me with a mix of fear and determination. "Diana," he said softly, his voice trembling, "tell me this wasn't a mistake." I stared at him, my heart racing, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. "It wasn't," I whispered. "It wasn't a mistake." The kiss lingered in my mind long after it ended. I barely slept that night, my thoughts spinning as I tried to process what had happened. It wasn't just the physicality of it, though that had been intoxicating. It was the way Ethan had looked at me, the raw vulnerability in his eyes that mirrored my own. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, but the guilt crept in quickly, wrapping itself around my chest like a vice. The next morning, I avoided him. I stayed in my bedroom for as long as I could, pretending to be busy with work emails and ignoring the world outside. But eventually, hunger forced me downstairs, where I found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, his gaze flicking up the moment I entered the room. "Morning," he said softly, his voice careful. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the coffee pot. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to act normal, or at least as normal as I could manage. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words, until Ethan finally stood. "I'm heading out for a bit," he said, grabbing his keys from the counter. "I'll see you later." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The sound of the door closing behind him was both a relief and a disappointment. Part of me wanted him to stay, to talk about what had happened. But another part, the part that had spent years keeping my emotions neatly contained, was terrified of what that conversation might lead to. The hours passed slowly. I busied myself with errands, chores, anything to keep my mind occupied. But it was no use. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The way his lips had felt against mine, the heat of his touch, the way his voice had trembled when he'd said my name. By the time evening rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves, unsure of what to do or say, when he came home. But Ethan didn't come home that night. At first, I was relieved, thinking the space would give me time to think. But as the hours ticked by, relief turned to worry. I tried to convince myself he was just out with friends, that he needed space as much as I did. But when midnight came and went, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. It wasn't until the next morning that I heard the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway. I was in the kitchen again, sipping coffee and pretending to read the news when he walked in, looking tired but determined. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Hey," I replied, setting my mug down. "You were out late. I needed to think," he said, running a hand through his hair. "About us." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but he stepped closer, cutting me off with a look. "Diana, I don't regret what happened," he said firmly. "I can't, but I need to know if you feel the same way." I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this is or where it's going, but I do know I haven't felt like this in a long time." The admission seemed to take the weight off his shoulders. He nodded, his expression softening. "Then let's figure it out, together." That was the moment everything changed. The unspoken tension that had simmered between us for weeks finally boiled over, and there was no going back. We tried to keep things discreet at first, stealing glances and brushing hands when no one was looking. But it wasn't long before the secrecy became part of the thrill, adding a dangerous edge to every encounter. One evening, while Mark was away on another business trip, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the living room. We were watching a movie, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, but the space between us felt charged. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I glanced over, he didn't look away. "Come here," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the TV. I hesitated for only a moment before sliding closer, my pulse quickening as his hand found mine. He didn't say anything else, just pulled me against him, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that stole the breath from my lungs. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the electricity crackling between us. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. The couch became our sanctuary, our secret, as we explored each other with a hunger that had been building for weeks. His hands were gentle but insistent, his lips tracing a path down my neck as I gasped and clung to him like he was the only thing keeping me grounded. For the first time in years, I felt desired, seen, and I never wanted it to end. In the days that followed, our relationship deepened. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniable. It was the way Ethan made me laugh, the way he listened when I spoke, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. He brought out a side of me I thought I'd lost, a side that was bold, carefree, and unapologetically alive. But with every stolen moment, the reality of our situation loomed larger. Mark wasn't stupid. He'd noticed the subtle shifts in my behavior. The way I seemed lighter, happier. He didn't know the truth, at least not yet, but I could see the questions forming in his eyes every time he looked at me. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed unbothered by the risk. If anything, the danger seemed to excite him, adding fuel to the fire that burned between us. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Ethan cornered me in the kitchen, his hands slipping around my waist as he pressed me against the counter. "What if he comes home early?" I whispered, my breath hitching, as his lips brushed against my ear. "Then we'll deal with it," he murmured, his voice low and teasing. "But right now, I can't think about anything except you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and all thoughts of caution vanished as I pulled him closer, losing myself in the heat of the moment. But as much as I wanted to believe we could keep our secret forever, I knew the truth was inevitable. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide the connection between us. And with every passing day, the stakes grew higher, the risks more daunting. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep everything under control. But deep down, I knew I was only delaying the inevitable. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and when it did, it would change everything. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what would happen when it did. The affair unfolded like a secret world, one that existed only for Ethan and me. During the day, we moved like ghosts around the house, careful to keep a polite distance whenever Mark was home. But when we were alone, it was as if the air between us became charged, humming with an energy neither of us could resist. Every glance, every touch, every word exchanged in secret felt like a thrill, a quiet rebellion against the lives we were supposed to be living. Our first full day alone together after Mark left for a week-long trip was the beginning of something we couldn't turn back from. It was a Sunday, warm and sunny, and Ethan had suggested we spend the afternoon outside. I'd agreed, thinking it would be harmless, just two people enjoying the weather. But the way he looked at me when we were sitting in the backyard, the way he leaned just a little too close when he handed me a glass of iced tea, made it clear that our definition of harmless had changed. "Why do you always wear your hair up?" he asked, his voice low as he brushed a loose strand from my face. "It's practical," I said, though my voice wavered under the weight of his gaze. "You should leave it down more often," he murmured, his fingers lingering at my temple. "It suits you." The way he said it, so soft and intimate, made my heart race. Before I could respond, he leaned closer, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, and entirely consuming. It wasn't like the desperate, fiery kisses we'd shared before. This one was different, lingering, filled with a tenderness that made me ache in ways I couldn't explain. That night, we didn't bother pretending to keep our distance. After dinner, I poured us both a glass of wine, and we sat on the couch, closer than we should have been. Ethan reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine, and when I looked at him, his expression was so open, so unguarded, that it took my breath away. "I don't want to hide this," he said softly, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "Not from you, at least." "We don't have a choice," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "If Mark ever found out." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I know, but that doesn't mean it has to be any less real." His words stayed with me, long after he kissed me goodnight and disappeared into his room. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering how we'd gotten here. How something so wrong could feel so painfully right. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We became experts at navigating the delicate balance of our lives, finding pockets of time where we could be together, without anyone suspecting. In the mornings, we'd linger in the kitchen just a little too long, brushing past each other as we poured coffee or reached for the same dish. At night, we'd steal kisses in the hallway, our bodies pressed close in the shadows as we tried to stay quiet. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Ethan found me in my home office, hunched over a pile of design sketches for a client. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. "You've been in here all day," he said. "Don't you ever take a break?" "I'm busy," I said, not looking up. But when I felt his hand on my shoulder, warm and solid, I couldn't stop the shiver that ran through me. "You need to relax," he murmured, his fingers brushing lightly against my neck. "You're too tense." I turned to him, intending to protest, but the words died on my lips when I saw the way he was looking at me. There was something in his eyes. Heat, yes, but also something deeper, something that made my heart twist. Before I could stop myself, I reached for him, pulling him down into a kiss that was anything but gentle. We didn't make it to the bedroom. The desk became our sanctuary, paper scattering to the floor as we lost ourselves in each other. His hands were everywhere, on my waist, my thighs, my back, like he couldn't get close enough, couldn't hold me tightly enough. And I wanted him to. I wanted to feel him, to let go of everything that had been weighing me down for so long. It wasn't always easy, though. The secrecy that made our relationship so thrilling also made it exhausting. Every glance over my shoulder, every carefully chosen word when Mark was around, felt like walking a tightrope. And the closer we got to each other, the harder it became to keep our emotions in check. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Ethan reached for my hand under the table, his fingers brushing against mine in a way that sent a shiver up my spine. I pulled away quickly, glancing toward the living room where Mark was watching TV. But the hurt in Ethan's eyes was unmistakable. "Why do you keep pushing me away when he's around?" he asked later, after Mark had gone to bed. We were standing in the kitchen, the room dimly lit by the glow of the stove light. "Because I have to," I said, my voice breaking. "Because if he finds out, it'll destroy everything." "Everything?" he repeated, his tone sharp. "Or just the life you've convinced yourself you're supposed to live?" His words cut deep, but they weren't wrong. I'd spent years clinging to the image of a perfect life, a perfect marriage, even as it crumbled around me. And now, with Ethan, I was realizing how much I'd been missing, how much I'd been denying myself. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be with you without feeling like I'm breaking apart." Ethan stepped closer, his hands resting on my shoulders as he looked into my eyes. "Then let it break," he said softly. "Let it all fall apart. Maybe that's the only way to figure out what you really want." His words stayed with me long after he kissed me goodnight and disappeared into his room. They echoed in my mind as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was right. If maybe the only way to find myself was to let everything else go. But letting go wasn't easy. The closer we became, the more complicated things got. Mark started noticing the subtle shifts in our dynamic, the way I seemed lighter, happier, and the way Ethan seemed to linger in my presence. He didn't say anything outright, but I could feel his suspicion growing, like a storm brewing on the horizon. And then there was Ethan. As much as I tried to keep him at arm's length, he refused to let me. He was relentless in his affection, his desire for me, and the intensity of his emotions was both exhilarating and terrifying. One night, as we sat on the back porch, the stars glittering overhead, Ethan turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't mean something to me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You mean something to me, Diana, and I need to know if I mean something to you." The vulnerability in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but the truth was caught in my throat, tangled with fear and doubt. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to do this." "You don't have to know," he said, his hand reaching for mine. "You just have to feel it." And I did. I felt it in every glance, every touch, every stolen moment we shared. But what terrified me most was the thought of what would happen when those moments ran out, when the truth we'd been hiding finally came to light. It was bound to unravel. The tension had been building for weeks, tightening around us like a noose. Mark's suspicion wasn't spoken outright, but it was there in the way his eyes lingered on Ethan and me during dinner. The subtle edge in his voice when he asked about my day. I tried to keep things as normal as possible, but every interaction with Ethan felt like walking a tightrope over a pit I wasn't sure I could escape. The breaking point came on a Friday night. Mark had been home more often lately, taking a sabbatical from work in what he called an attempt to reconnect with the family. His presence threw off the fragile balance Ethan and I had built. With him around, there were no stolen glances, no whispered touches, no moments where we could just be us. The house felt suffocating. That evening, Mark suggested a family dinner. "The three of us should sit down and have a proper meal," he said, his tone more commanding than inviting. I agreed, though the thought of the three of us at the same table made my stomach churn. I prepared a roast and set the table, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. Ethan joined us reluctantly, his jaw tight as he sat across from Mark. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences that felt heavier than they should have. I could barely eat, my appetite lost to the tension hanging over the room. "So, Ethan?" Mark said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "How's the job hunt going? Any luck yet?" Ethan glanced up, his expression guarded. "Still looking," he said curtly. "It takes time." Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze narrowing. It's been months. Maybe it's time to consider something more practical. You can't keep floating through life, you know. Ethan's jaw tightened, and I saw the flash of anger in his eyes. I'm figuring it out, he said, his voice clipped. Not everyone follows the same path, Mark. The tension between them was palpable, and I could feel the conversation veering into dangerous territory. Let's just enjoy dinner, I said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. But neither of them was listening. I'm just saying, Mark continued, his tone sharp. You've been living here rent-free for a while now. Maybe it's time to start pulling your weight. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I didn't ask to stay here, he snapped. You're the one who offered. And maybe that was a mistake. Mark shot back, his voice rising. You're not a kid anymore, Ethan. It's time to grow up. That's rich, coming from you, Ethan said, his voice dripping with venom. You're never even here. You don't know anything about me. Enough, I shouted, my voice breaking through the escalating argument. Both of them turned to look at me, their faces filled with shock and anger. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the weight of their gazes pressing down on me. I can't do this, I said, my voice trembling. I can't sit here and pretend like everything's fine when it's not. Mark's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as he looked between Ethan and me. What's going on here? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Is there something you're not telling me? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan looked at me, his eyes pleading, but I couldn't speak. The truth was on the tip of my tongue, threatening to spill out and destroy everything. Diana, Mark said, his tone insistent. What's going on? That night, I locked myself in the bedroom, my thoughts spinning out of control. I could hear Mark and Ethan arguing downstairs, their voices muffled but unmistakably heated. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't stop replaying the look in Mark's eyes. The suspicion, the betrayal. When the house finally went quiet, I opened the door cautiously, stepping out into the dimly lit hallway. I found Ethan sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard me, his expression weary. Are you okay? I asked softly, sitting down beside him. No, he admitted, his voice raw. I can't keep doing this, Diana. I can't keep pretending like none of this matters. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. It's not that simple, I said. Mark, he knows something's off. If he finds out... What if he does? Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. What if he knows? What then? Are you going to keep lying to him? To yourself? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The truth was, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to reconcile the life I'd built with the life I wanted. Ethan, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't know how to fix this. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. Maybe it's not about fixing it, he said softly. Maybe it's about letting go of what's broken. The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. Mark barely spoke to me, his expression cold and distant. Ethan kept his distance too, retreating to his room for most of the day. I spent the afternoon cleaning, hoping the mindless task would quiet my thoughts, but it was no use. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and I knew something had to give. That evening, Mark confronted me in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on mine. We need to talk, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded, my heart pounding. Okay. He took a deep breath, his gaze hardening. What's going on between you and Ethan? The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt the floor shift beneath me, the weight of my lies threatening to crush me. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, Ethan walked into the room. Stop, he said, his voice firm. Don't do this. Mark turned to him, his eyes blazing. What are you talking about? Ethan stepped closer, his posture tense but unwavering. You already know, don't you? He said. You've known for weeks, so stop pretending like you don't. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face contorted with anger, and I could feel the walls of my carefully constructed life crumbling around me. Get out, Mark said finally, his voice shaking with rage. Both of you, get out of my house. That night I packed a bag, my hands trembling as I shoved clothes into a suitcase. Ethan came to my room, his expression filled with guilt and determination. I'm sorry, he said, his voice soft. I didn't mean for it to end like this. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. It's not your fault. It's mine. We left the house together, stepping into the cool night air as the door closed behind us. I didn't know where we were going or what would happen next, but for the first time in years, I felt free. Terrified, but free. The ride away from Mark's house was silent. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the gear shift. The road stretched out ahead of us, dark and unfamiliar, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely untethered. There was no home to return to, no foundation to fall back on. Everything I'd built, my marriage, my life as I knew it, was gone. I couldn't stop the questions swirling in my mind. What had I done? What kind of woman leaves her husband, her home, for a relationship that defied every rule of morality? But even in the midst of my guilt and self-doubt, there was a quiet voice whispering that I had done what I had to do. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. We stopped at a roadside motel a few hours away, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and paper-thin walls. Ethan carried my suitcase up the stairs while I followed, feeling numb and hollow. Once we were inside, I sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet while he set the suitcase down in the corner. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, sitting beside me. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to begin." Ethan reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." I looked at him, searching his face for reassurance. He looked so sure, so certain, but I wasn't. All I could think about was Mark, his anger, his betrayal, the life I had torn apart. And yet, sitting there in that tiny motel room with Ethan, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next few weeks were a blur of emotion. Ethan and I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far enough from Mark's home that we wouldn't risk running into anyone we knew. The space was modest, just one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room that doubled as a dining area, but it felt like ours. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. We fell into a strange rhythm, navigating this new life together. Ethan found work at a local auto repair shop, using the skills he'd picked up during his college years. I threw myself into freelance interior design projects, desperate to keep my mind occupied. The work was therapeutic, giving me a sense of purpose, even as I grappled with the fallout of my decisions. But the guilt never really went away. It crept in during quiet moments, whispering in the back of my mind like a ghost I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, his anger, his hurt, his disbelief. I wondered if he'd moved on, if he hated me, if he regretted ever letting me into his life. Ethan noticed, of course. He always did. "You can't keep punishing yourself," he said one evening as we sat on the couch, the soft glow of the TV illuminating his face. "What happened with Mark? It's over. You made a choice. We both did." "I destroyed his life," I said, my voice trembling. "I destroyed everything." Ethan turned to me, his eyes filled with an intensity that took my breath away. "You didn't destroy anything. That marriage was already broken. You just didn't want to admit it." His words cut deep, but they weren't wrong. Mark and I had been living like strangers for years, clinging to a life that no longer existed. Ethan hadn't broken my marriage, he'd exposed the cracks that were already there. But the past wasn't done with us yet. One afternoon, as I was returning from a meeting with a client, I found Mark waiting outside our apartment building. He was leaning against his car, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. My heart sank as I approached, clutching my bag tightly. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We need to talk," he said simply. I hesitated, glancing around the parking lot before finally nodding. "Okay." We sat in his car, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mark turned to me, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Why?" he asked, his voice low. "Why him?" I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "I didn't plan for this to happen," I said. "I didn't want it to happen, but it did." "That's not an answer," he said sharply. "What does he have that I don't?" "It's not about that," I said, my voice rising. "It's about me, about what I needed. And I needed to feel alive. I needed to feel like I mattered." Mark stared at me, his jaw tightening. "So what now? You think this thing with Ethan is gonna last? You think it's real?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. "But I had to take the chance." He shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "You've always been good at running away, Diana." His words stung, but I didn't argue. He wasn't entirely wrong. I had been running from a life that felt hollow, from a marriage that had become a prison, but for the first time, I wasn't running alone. Mark's visit marked a turning point. It forced me to confront the reality of what I had done, to accept that there was no going back. But it also gave me clarity. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how to move forward. Ethan and I began to rebuild our lives, piece by piece. We faced judgment from those who knew the truth, whispers and side glances that followed us wherever we went. But we also found moments of joy. Quiet mornings spent drinking coffee on the balcony, late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, the simple comfort of knowing we had each other. There were challenges, of course. Ethan's youth and my past made us an unconventional pair, and there were times when the weight of our decisions felt almost too heavy to bear. But in those moments, he reminded me why I had taken the leap in the first place. "I love you," he said one night as we lay in bed, his hand resting lightly on my waist. "No matter what happens, I love you." "I love you too," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The future was uncertain, and I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as I sat on the balcony one evening watching the sun set over the city, I realized that I didn't need all the answers. For now, it was enough to simply be here, to be present, to be alive. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid.